Author of life, we thank you for your word, and we ask that your Spirit would be with us this morning to transform us in heart and mind and soul. Amen. We're continuing our Back to Church Without the Hurt series this morning, where I'm unpacking some popular Christian phrases that might have done harm to people inside and outside the church. If you joined us last week, you heard a fairly dense sermon about the history of biblical interpretation, so that we could lay a groundwork in the truth that the Bible is a multi-layered book, rich in meaning, and sometimes rich with meanings that don't agree with each other. That was a necessary step in this sermon series because the kinds of phrases that we are going to look at this week and next week are ones that might personally bring you comfort and for which you could make a fairly reasonable scriptural argument. So if there's one thing that I hope you get from this entire series, it's this. Often the harms that we do to each other stem from a lack of complexity. In other words, when we oversimplify the world around us, we often do so at the expense of each other's experiences and feelings. And to show you what I mean, let's get to this morning's group of phrases, because really there's a whole cloud of sayings that all convey essentially the same idea in different ways. These phrases are things like, everything happens for a reason, it's all a part of God's plan, or my personal least favorite that you sometimes hear people say around a death, well, God just needed another angel. Now, like I said, some of these might personally have brought you comfort during times of hardship and grief. I know that when things don't go right in my life, I often want there to be a reason for why things are the way they are. It makes me feel a little more secure to imagine creation as a perfectly ordered thing that can be rationally understood. But imagine that you're the school teacher in Morocco who returned last week to the remote village where you had been teaching a class of 32 children to find that every single one of those children died in an earthquake. What part of God's plan needed for that to happen? Or imagine that you're the child in Derna, Libya, who stood on top of your 7th-story building as floodwaters ripped away every other building on your street, as you watched those waters carry away the bodies of your aunts and uncles and best friends. What reason was there for sparing you while almost everyone you know and loved is dying a cruel and sudden death before your eyes? Or perhaps, to bring it closer to home, what good do you think it does to tell the grieving parents of a dead toddler, as I saw happen to a cousin of mine, that God took their child because he needed another angel? Is God so jealous and lacking in compassion that he would cause you heartbreak just to satisfy his desires? Now, if you want to make meaning for your own life in these kinds of phrases, don't let me stop you. In fact, I'll give you some scriptural reasons to do so in just a second. But what I need us to be aware of is that when we try to make meaning out of other people's pains on their behalf, then we're entering into very dangerous waters. It's like I said a few weeks ago when we talked about Job. Job's friends did a great job being there for their friend right up until they opened their mouths. For 7 days and 7 nights, they sat in silent compassion with him. But the minute that they started to try and explain why he was going through the misfortunes that he was going through, they missed the mark. In fact, Job is one of those places that we could turn to in order to try and find evidence that everything does happen for a reason. If you'll remember the conclusion of Job, it's that 38 chapters into the book, God finally shows up to explain himself. And the explanation that Job receives is a defense rooted in the inscrutability of God. God has a plan for the cosmos, but it's beyond our understanding. God knows the things that we cannot know, and so we can never fully understand all the machinations of the divine. So yes, according to the author of Job, everything does have a reason. We just don't always know what it is. And this is rooted in ideas presented in Proverbs about the orderliness of the universe, that all things are perfectly set up in just the right way, and all we have to do is follow the rules of creation, and we will experience happiness. Again, there's a plan, there is a reason, things are orderly and predictable. And this isn't just a comforting thought from a religious perspective, but an anthropological one as well. We're creatures who survive and thrive because of our ability to detect patterns. Our brains are hardwired to want predictability and some sense of reasonability. But it doesn't take too much living on this planet to run into situations that just don't make sense. Things that seem to strike out of the blue for no clear reason, or times when good things happen to bad people, or when bad things happen to good people. In theological terms, this problem of evil's existence in the light of God's goodness is what we call theodicy. And so the scriptures speak to this reality as well. In addition to the wisdom texts of Job and Proverbs, we get a third entry in this genre, Ecclesiastes. Traditionally, Ecclesiastes is ascribed to King Solomon, writing at the end of his life. But the author of the text is named within the text as Qoheleth. And this is the name by which many scholars refer to the book. Qoheleth is different from the other wisdom texts because it isn't merely a collection of sayings like Proverbs, and it's not a parable like Job, but it's instead the musings of someone in their old age looking back on the things that they've done and learned over the course of their life. You're most likely to know this book by the passage used occasionally in funerals, or famously by the Byrds in the song Turn, 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 where we are reminded that to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. But as we heard today, Qoheleth often seems frustrated with the folly or the madness of life. In this morning's passage, we heard them bemoan the fact that all of their hard work could mean nothing after they die, that they have toiled and exercised wisdom, but there is no accounting for what, or more specifically, who will come after them. Later in chapter 4, they'll go on to proclaim that those who have died are better off than the living, but the ones who have never been born at all are better off than the living or the dead, because they've not yet seen the evils that are done under the sun. Qoheleth is not a book of silver linings. What it essentially boils down to is you live, you die, some stuff happens in the middle, a lot of it is bad. So you just keep your chin up, make reliable friends, and you do your best. Or, as we heard Qoheleth say this morning, eat and drink and find enjoyment in your toil. So what does all of this amount to for us as we try to be a community that better lives in to that first instruction of the Methodist societies to do no harm? First and foremost, I think that the multivocality of the scriptures, which is a fancy way of saying the presence of more than one voice in the scriptures, is a reminder for us that not every response is helpful in every situation. There are going to be times when people need to feel like there's a reason that what is happening to them is happening. And there are also going to be times when people need to just be able to shake their fists at the heavens in anger about the randomness and the unpredictability of life. It takes a great deal of wisdom to know which response is the right one in any given situation. So more often than not, we are better off just being present with people, giving them a shoulder to cry on and a sympathetic ear while they work out for themselves what it is that they need in that moment. The word compassion literally means to suffer with. So in order for us to be compassionate, we have to let ourselves just exist alongside someone in their suffering. We do not have to solve it. Second, sometimes things do happen for a reason. And the reason is that there is no accounting for how other people are going to behave. Broadly speaking, the bad things that happen in this world are either natural or human caused. The natural stuff is the kind of stuff that makes us join with Job in looking to the heavens for some kind of answer. Why does there need to be cancer in the world? Why do we have to have earthquakes and floods? I'm sure if you sit with these questions long enough, you might come to a scientific conclusion. But I still struggle to find a moral conclusion. The human stuff, though, that's the stuff that we don't get to place on God. War, poverty, homelessness, hunger, inequitable access to health care, none of that is on God. Those are all the results of human decisions with human costs. So what we're not going to do is say that any of the suffering that people go through as a result of any of that is a part of God's plan. It is not. Full stop. If we put that on God, then we have taken the name of the Lord in vain. And if we are going to say that any of that happens for a reason, then we need to be clear about that reason. And to name that reason, I'm going to have to use another one of those church words that can be harmful to people, so I need you to hang with me for a second. If we are going to say that any of that human-created suffering happens for a reason, then we need to be clear that the reason is sin. If you've heard me talk about sin before, then you already know that I don't use sin to mean that we are miserable little creatures who are utterly incapable of any good and who ought to be constantly ashamed of ourselves. That is not how God views us, so it shouldn't be how we view ourselves. What I mean when I say sin is that it is a result of a separation from God's love. When we sin, we fail to live into the great commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves and to love the Lord our God with all our heart and soul and mind. So yes, sometimes terrible things happen to us, and sometimes there is a reason for that, and the reason is that people don't always show love toward one another like they should. The last thing that I'm going to suggest for us this morning is that it's okay to make meaning for yourself, but it's not okay to make meaning for others. Again, this is one of those places where you might think that I'm leading us into the wilderness of relativism. But what I mean to say is this: you can process a tragedy in your own life and eventually come to the answer that brings you peace. If you try to do that for someone else, you deny them their agency, and you risk adding to the harm that they've already experienced. To put it simply, you can't tell someone else how they are supposed to feel. Now, that's not to say that you can't be there for them to bounce their thoughts off of, or that you can't be there for them to vent as they process, or that you can't offer them resources or ideas, including your own experiences, as a way for them to work toward healing. All of that is good and supportive work. but we need to create non-judgmental spaces for one another where we can be vulnerable and honest about everything that we are going through. I know that it is tempting to want to rush to the answer, to want to tell people something that will bring closure right in that moment. But wounds, whether they are physical, emotional, or spiritual, take time to heal. So be gentle with one another. Be patient, be present, and above all else, be loving. Amen. Please pray with me. God, you are love. And this morning we ask you to share your love with us and through us. We have felt your love in times of trial and hardship. We have been shown your love through this community of faith. Let us extend that love to all who need, to our neighbors close to home and around the world. You lived and died with us through your Son, Jesus the Christ, as a sign of your compassion for us, as a sign that you suffer with us. Give us that love for one another, so that we might never fail to be present for each other in our hour of need. Amen.